Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon to those joining live, and thank you also for anyone else joining in on the recorded sessions. My name is Max Gordon. I'm a member of the 42 Bedford Row employment team, and I'll be leading this seminar in the employment webinar series looking at schedules of loss. And the aim of this seminar is to give a practical outline on common points to look out for, including some examples of, for example, applying adjustments and calculations, but they're more for reference and guidance to sort of show how the principles are applied, perhaps to refer back on. A polite reminder as ever that webinars and seminars are not intended to be legal advice. It's only for an oversight, and certainly hope it will be helpful. But all matters, of course, turn on their own facts. So if you have any concerns or any issues you're considering in a legal context, it is always advisable to seek legal advice and/or representation. An overview of today's seminar, and as one might expect, it's slightly claimant focused because, of course, generally claimants producing the schedules of loss. However, there are important factors for the respondents to be, and respondents' representatives to be up on top of and to have to get to grips with, because, of course, schedules of loss can't just be accepted. Sometimes there will be disputes, and there will often be cases, whether directed or just on a respondent's own volition, where a counter schedule can be helpful and a very persuasive document. And certainly schedules can't just be taken as read. So first we'll consider the importance of a schedule of loss being a live document, how it can change, the format, how helpfully to set it out, make it nice and user-friendly, nice and easy for those drafting it to change things, noting, of course, the updates that have to take place. Addressing the raw data, gross and net figures, and how important that is, and the importance of discussing the same, what can be agreed, for example. Knowing what you can and cannot claim, and I'll particularly have a focus on a specific look at what makes up a week's pay and the importance of that can play, for example, when coming to apply a statutory cap. The importance of being specific in the pleading and the benefits that can come from that. Knowing the order, by that I mean the order in which adjustments are to be applied, because if they are applied in the wrong order, it can have very significant impacts. And as I say, I'll go through a couple of examples of some of the main points we'll be covering. So starting off, of course, schedules of loss are important documents. It's the chance to set out clearly what is being claimed. Equally, a counter schedule is a chance to show pending liability, what is agreed or what is not agreed. It can help narrow the issues, and that's very helpful at tribunal and for the employment tribunal itself. Or, of course, it can always assist settlement, or, in fact, highlight parties where they thought they may have been far apart. Perhaps it can narrow the points and bring them closer to settlement if that is something being considered and on the table. And as noted in the presidential guidance, note 615, as I've set out here on the slide, the guidance itself notes the importance of the document being updated nearer to the hearing, and the importance of it being produced early on in proceedings, because it can help settlement. It needs to set out the stall of what is between the parties. And of course, the update is often focused on updating mitigating circumstances, additional payments received, making changes if needed. However, I would emphasize that it's not just limited to that. If, for example, particularly where the right information has all been set out in a schedule of loss, if there's sometimes a calculation error, or perhaps the application of law needs to be just adjusted and corrected, which may alter the totals, for example, how the cap is applied or the adjustments have been made. In practice, an employment tribunal is going to allow that to happen because it's really just a correcting exercise. So particularly from a respondent's perspective, if it's noted that perhaps there are errors or the claimant hasn't quite set out things to maximize their schedule as they might be able to, a respondent shouldn't just consider that it's then just going to be set in stone and that they're bound, a claimant will be bound by that. Equally important for claimants, of course, to bear that in mind. So as important as it is, and getting it right can be very helpful, very important, changes can be made and changes will be made. So it is always important to consider that it is somewhat a live document, and it's not just going to be stationary and set out in stone. The format. Now, formats, of course, will change. It's very much a stylistic choice. I only set out, I'll set out an example in a moment, as a option, certainly not a binding one. But the key points I want to emphasize is to make it user-friendly, set out in columns, make it easier to follow, makes it easier to change, use subtotals, use headings, things like that. Set out the essential information at the start of a schedule so that it can be referred to, and indeed it doesn't hurt to repeat it. For example, your net and gross figures, repeat it further down to help with the calculations. Include both gross and net figures when discussing schedules with other practitioners. A common comment was that often just only one is included, which of course you need both. Discuss the raw data and agree it if possible. This is a point I'd also add as a comment. You often see, for example, income pleaded in the ET1, and it's not responded to in the ET3. And it's a very important and helpful step where if that can be set out to show what is agreed, what is not agreed, if we know the figures both parties are working from, it makes things a lot easier further down the line. And that is where you may want to consider whether a counter schedule is to be considered. As I say, it doesn't have to be ordered, and most often helpful if it looks like the parties are going to be quite far apart. From a respondent's perspective, if you're going to say, oh, well, the schedule of loss, for whatever reason, is incorrect, it's a lot more persuasive to then have a document ready to go in an easy-to-use format that says, well, no, this is, respectfully, how it should be, and this is the case that we believe we have to answer. And it's a lot easier to guide a tribunal, and indeed the other party, to show perhaps why the dispute is there. As I say, this is just an example of a setup. You see, I use columns. I use a header in the normal way as you would with any pleading, setting out the important information at the top. This example considers an unfair dismissal with some other unlawful deduction points and a finding of contributory conduct as well. And just going down, I think, yes. So onto, this is just the same section, just brought down slightly. You can include some explanation. Now, I'd advise, again, personal style, but I advise it's not to have realms of novel, lots of paragraphs in a schedule. But if there's some explanation or some reference to a legal principle you're making clear, the example here being how the week's pay was being considered, taking into consideration commission, for example, and indeed pension on this example as well, the importance being applying on statutory cap, which I'll come on to. It can help to have this explanation, because if you just slap down a figure and it's a little bit unclear how that figure has been arrived at, it's going to straight away possibly lead to raising a dispute. Whereas if you've got a clear explanation, as given in this example, it can show how, of course, all these figures are arrived at, and perhaps fast forward to everyone hopefully agreeing, so you get a nice, neat schedule that can be agreed between the parties. So first, I'll consider the basic award, again, considering an unfair dismissal point. And the basic award is generally, in practice, the one that I see people get calculations correct on and setting out quite well. The standard process is set out here. You have 1.5 weeks gross pay for each year of employment, not below the age of 41, 1 week for between 41 and 22, and then half a week's gross pay for each year of employment below the age of 22. The only point sometimes that can cause some confusion or some issues is where there is an individual's continuous service straddles over one of these margins, and the higher rate will only apply for the complete year of service that has been worked at that age, i.e. if you think about the wording not below the age of 41, so by the time you've reached your 42nd birthday, the higher rate will apply, and of course that goes down on the other phases. The maximums on The basic award, again, with considering a gross pay and a week's pay is defined in sections 220 to 229 in the ERA 1996. I'll come on to that a little bit more detail shortly. The maximum amounts are set, that's changed every April, currently 643, and therefore with a maximum number of years being 20, you get a current total of 19,290, which would be the maximum basic award that can be claimed. Going on to just consider what makes up a week's pay, what's in a week's pay. As it probably sounds, it's often the contractual remuneration owed, but it can sometimes be a bit more complicated than that. So obligatory overtime only accounts if the obligation to work and to provide that work is mutual. Contractual bonuses can be included. However, discretionary bonuses, unless deemed as a contractual term, are not included. Tips. Now, in principle, they can be included. However, it wouldn't include cash left by customers, and it also wouldn't include money that is distributed through a common fund system. And so often in industries where tips are often part of pay received, that is often the case. So I do actually personally question the circumstance where this may apply, but in principle, it certainly can. Where commission, as you saw in the example of the schedule I set out before, where commission forms a regular part of pay, that can be included as well. And also, as can pension contributions. Now, of course, an important part is not to double count. If you're including it at least in a week's pay, you can't include it as a separate amount. The importance of that, again, also being on the statutory cap under compensation, which we'll come to. But benefits in kind, such as lodging, they do not count in a week's pay. Now, of course, taking all these into account, you may have differences on each month. So therefore, to take what will be a week's pay, you need to take an average. Now, the wider the sample, or the specimen, the better. I would perhaps suggest, on average, you see 3 months is about the minimum, 5 months is better. This can often be a point that a respondent will want to be particularly aware of, because, for example, if you see an average of 3 months, it includes commission payments. It depends on what those 3 months were. Are they representative or are they unusual? Sometimes you have seasonal affected work, bumpers around Christmas, for example. So if it is better and frankly more representative from both sides to at least take a year and that information is available, then that should and could be done to show more of a balanced representation. And of course, that can be benefit or detrimental to either side, depending on how those figures will fall. The basic award can be subject to adjustments, firstly under contributory conduct, section 122, subsection 2. And that is under what the tribunal considers to be just and equitable. Now, this is a slightly different test to contributory conduct adjustment under compensatory award, where the consideration is the contributory conduct that led to dismissal, for example. In practice, it is unusual to see a different percentage applied, adjustment that is, to the basic award and the compensatory award, but it is possible. Arguably, there is more discretion in the basic award under the just and equitable consideration. However, it's somewhat unusual, and the authorities guide us to show that generally the same percentage will be applied. There are limits on adjustments in certain cases, and the reference for this is under section 1223 of the Employment Rights Act 1996. Generally, this applies if there is a reason for dismissal requiring the minimum award. Currently that's 7,886, or it's 5,000 if it's a blacklisting case. So this can include examples where the reason for dismissal was that the employee was designated with preventing or reducing risk to health and safety, and they were a representative for workers or employees on matters of health and safety, or they've generally been a representative or employees or a trustee of a relevant occupational pension scheme. And if that is the case, and one of these exceptions applies, the contributory conduct reduction only applies to the difference between the standard case and the minimum. So in an example, if in normal circumstances a basic award would have been £2,000, for example, any contribution can only then apply between that and the minimum award of the 7,836. So the reduction would only apply to the difference between those two figures. There can also be other considerations that can lead to adjustments. So, for example, the unreasonable refusal to accept an offer of reinstatement. Again, this comes under the tribunal's consideration of what's just and equitable, the broader consideration of contributory conduct, and any redundancy payment that has been made to an employee may be deducted from the basic award. Also, however, on the other hand, if tribunals find that the real reason for dismissal was not redundancy, the claimant may be entitled to both of those payments. Mitigation, however, does not apply to the basic award, nor does recoupment, a point I will go into slightly more detail on the compensatory side of things. And as a reminder, the basic award is subject to tax, and it goes to the tax-free amount. So, of course, with the maximum, you're unlikely to sort of go over that, but of course, it takes away from that £30,000 award that is tax-free. After the £30,000, an award will be taxed, and that's where consideration, for example, of grossing up will be coming into play. Again, a point we'll be coming to. So moving on to the compensatory award, again, similar format, show you're working, always helpful to show how you're coming to the figures that you're discussing. Again, you can include similar detail. In practice, you often see that, for example, in mitigation section, there may be reasons that a claimant has struggled with mitigation, the climate, maybe they have a disability, making it difficult to find a work that can be adjusted for them, things like that, of why it can be hard for a claimant to mitigate. Short information on the steps taken to mitigate their loss, for example, can also be included in the schedule. I've highlighted the point there, as I said earlier. If you're including, for example, pension loss in the calculation of the week's pay, make sure you're not seeking to double count on a schedule. The compensatory award, as it sounds, is to compensate the claimant, not punish the respondent. It looks at the financial losses if they had not been unfairly dismissed. The mirror of this point, for example, the discriminatory awards would be the financial losses had the unlawful act not been undertaken. But here, just focusing on compensatory award on unfair dismissal examples, you're also looking at the immediate loss of earnings, for example, and then the future loss. Future loss will sometimes be pending, of course, the issues of mitigation, how long it's been since the effective date of termination, and the tribunal. It may be that there is no future loss, that the claimant has been successful in getting you work at effectively the same pay, or perhaps the tribunal take a view that by the time the tribunals come around, that the claimant reasonably ought to have obtained that type of work. Loss of your employment rights, your statutory right, and loss of benefits and pension rights also included under the compensatory limb. The figures you're considering in the compensatory award are net. There is no limit on a week's pay amount, but of course the cap is applied differently. But on the starting point, the calculations on the compensatory award, no limit, unlike under the basic. And then what can be considered sometimes under the limited number of weeks, or really the total, is the statutory cap, calculated at the lower of now currently £105,707 or 52 weeks gross pay. So that is why what makes up a week's gross pay can be very influential. If you're going to be under that 105,000 mark, what makes up the 52 weeks, obviously from a claimant's perspective, wants to be as high as possible, because if the compensatory award, the total award is going to, well, the compensatory award is going to be over the cap. Of course, the cap is going to be your ceiling. So if you can take the 52 weeks as high as possible, that can make a difference to the total that the claimant can be entitled to. Coming on to the order of adjustments. Now, this is a simplified step. I'm going to go through in more detail, but the main takeaway, if nothing else is remembered, the order of adjustments, then grossing up, then any interest is applied, and then the cap. And the cap being last tends to be quite important, but all stages to make sure it goes in this order. The importance of this, of course, is if there are deductions or percentages are taken in different orders, that can have a significant impact on the figures that you're working with and the end total. The authority that first consider this is digital equipment, and it's established, for example, that ex gratia payments are to be taken first. And before going on to the more detailed breakdown, one point stuck out to me as a slightly interesting point is the authority of civil aviation has considered by the Courts of Appeal that POLCI deductions are to be taken before contributory conduct and compensatory award. This just struck out to me because mathematically the difference would be negligible or doesn't really have an effect. But what the Courts of Appeal considered is that where a POLCI deduction is taken, the effect of that may have an influence, or it may be a factor when then coming to apply any contributory conduct adjustment. So taking a summary of the adjustments. Now, this takes all examples as much as possible that can be applied in one order. So not all of these will, of course, apply to each case. The first is to take a deduction of any payment, the ex gratia payments or payment in lieu of notice, but not any enhanced redundancy payment. Note, however, that where the tribunal has made an award for wrongful dismissal, as opposed to the employer making payment in lieu of notice, that there is a choice as to the order of calculation there. The second step is to consider mitigation, or indeed the failure to mitigate, it's under section 123. As mentioned earlier, the deductions, for example, if there's been employment in the interim between the dismissal with the respondent and the hearing, the claimant has new employment, or should the employee have obtained a new job and therefore sets a cut-off date for when that could apply. Third is the just and equitable reductions under section 123, and that also comes to consider the POLCI reductions as well. Next, fourth is your ACAS adjustments, and of course that can be plus or minus 25% under section 207A for failure to follow the ACAS guidance. In practice, you can of course have in between those figures 0 to 25% in the discretion of the tribunal. The next step is adjustments of up to 4 weeks' pay in respect of employees' failure to provide full and accurate written particulars. Again, obviously only in a case where that applies. The next is the percentage reduction for an employee's contributory fault, i.e. what actions could it be said, or does the tribunal make a finding that caused or contributed to their dismissal. And then seventh, the deduction of any enhanced redundancy payment to the extent that it exceeds the basic award. And finally, and that all-important last step, is that's where the statutory cap is then applied last. Going on to consider just outside of the unfair dismissal examples, of course, under discrimination compensation, again, the aim is to put the claimant back in the position as if the unlawful act did not occur. it looks at the financial losses, as I mentioned earlier. It's broadly very similar to the unfair dismissal losses, loss of income, for example, from perhaps either the dismissal or having to leave employment, things of that nature. Again, you consider net figures, but the key difference is there is no limit on pay or weeks. There's no cap applied to discriminatory compensation. And it can consider the employment tribunal can consider the chance of employment not continuing and the chance of particular employment arising in the future. And of course, the extra or the additional point to consider under discrimination compensation is the injury to feelings. And again, an important point that came when discussing this with other practitioners is to give a figure. I'm sure those watching perhaps familiar with the Vento bandings, lower, middle, and upper, which of course do an update each year as well for those figures. And it can be very helpful to give more of a guide, not just to, for example, say seeking injury to feelings, middle Vento band, actually put a figure on it. So and again, you're not going to be bound by that. It comes to the discretion of the employment tribunal. They can award higher or lower. Of course, from a claimant's perspective, to be persuasive, you are probably setting out the stall, so the chances of it being higher, perhaps less. But it's important just to give a good guide. So, for example, use a figure that's, if it's lower middle, set out a figure that will show that. Don't just use a band, as that can be quite broad and not as helpful. Just a couple of slides considering some of these points like slightly more detail. The ACAS adjustment is in the employment tribunal's discretion, can range between 0 and 25%. In practice, where it is applied, I often do see it just applied at the maximum rather in stages, but it can be at any of those values. And again, before contributory conduct is where that is to be applied. Grossing up, this is comes to an example about where you're talking above the tax-free element. And the main consideration here is about putting the claimant in the position, had the unlawful act not occurred, they're in pocket position effectively, because if they're to be taxed on it, that needs to be taken into consideration. This applies in damages for unfair dismissal, wrongful dismissal, and financial losses from unlawful discrimination. You do not apply grossing up to figures calculated using gross figures or to injury to feelings. Just a brief example, considering a tax bracket of 20%, again, adjustments, grossing up, then the statutory cap. Here, I just consider, as a rough example, basic award of 11,000, compensatory award of 80,000. So you first need to consider your tax-free element. So then you can figure out what is the bracket to be taxed, gross up that part of the compensation. So here, considering a 20% tax bracket, so going up by divided by 0.8. The total compensation can then be calculated by adding those figures together, and then you apply a cap. In this case, I've used the old cap from pre-April 2023. And that is where you then have your total award calculated. Recoupment, I included this as it's often a point I see on schedules that perhaps isn't always dealt with correctly or needs some adjustment. This applies if the claimant has been receiving benefits that they would not otherwise have been receiving had they, for example, remained in employment. It's whether a state recovers that from the respondent. And I put that as emphasis because it is not mitigation. I often see, for example, universal credit or whatever it may be, set out under mitigation or set out as a deduction on the amounts on the schedule of loss. And it isn't a deduction, it is still to be paid. It's just that it doesn't go to the claimant. This applies in unfair dismissal and issues of failure to make guaranteed payment, for example. Notably, recoupment does not apply in settlements. So this can sometimes be an incentive on settlements. So the respondent could take a consideration of, well, if we knock what would be in recruitment off. It wouldn't go to the claimant anyway. It can obviously bring the figures closer together and sometimes induce settlement where otherwise it may not have been considered. Something to bear in mind for both parties. You do not apply recoupment to compensation for discrimination. It does not apply to dismissal by reason of redundancy. The guidance note on this sets out the reasoning as we've just gone through, and important to note the information that needs to be provided, that the claimant needs to specify the type of benefits, the dates of receipt, and the amount, and the claimant will need to provide their national insurance number. And when considering recruitment, you'll have to go on to consider the prescribed elements, the amount of the award that will be held back effectively for the DWP if they are to give a notice to take what they state is owed from. It applies to the immediate loss of wages. It's not applicable to loss of statutory rights, written particulars, or lost benefits or pension. And it will reduce in line with adjustments for contributory fault and proportionally to the statutory cap, which is what I'll set out in an example in a moment. As I say, this is the amount that will be held back from an award. The DWP will then, if applicable, give a notice to say what they are claiming, and then the remainder will be paid onto a claimant. And it's important to note in any judgment or order, given where recruitment is in play, it must specify the amount of the prescribed element and what will be held back for those purposes. Now, I note there's slightly a lot of figures, and it's perhaps a harder thing to follow as an example in a webinar format. It's really just to perhaps be an example to refer back to and to make clear the point I mean about the proportionate shifting when considering recruitment. So here at the top, I've just set out the figures I'm considering in this example: 11,000 basic, the compensatory award 100,000, with 30,000 being the immediate loss. I've considered a contributory conduct of 20%. So first, I've made the adjustments for contribution, then gross up. You then find the compensatory award being the remainder plus the grossed up figure. Again, I'm using the old cap as in this example. So you then apply the cap. The top of this slide, again, is just a repeat of the figures just for ease of reference. But then this is the point I want to use this example. It's before the contributory conduct and the cap, you would have had a compensatory award of £100,200. But after the adjustments, it's obviously less than that. And it's that percentage difference that also then needs to be applied to the prescribed element. So finding the percentage difference here comes to approximately 6.3%, shown here. So that is the amount of the prescribed element. So the immediate loss was 30,000. That needs to be adjusted by 6.3% as well. Therefore, in this example, the prescribed element, that part of the award to be held back from the DWP to consider what, if anything, it wants to take from, is also reduced and becomes £28,110. So to recap the points of this seminar, the importance that a schedule of loss can and will change. It's a live document. It is always best to put the best foot forward, make it nice and clear, and of course have it right from the off. But if it isn't, do not think that it is then set there. It can change. And of course, there are points where it has to change, where mitigation has taken place from the start of a claim to when you finally get your employment tribunal date. Use a format that is user-friendly for yourself, for the other side, and for the tribunal. Make it easy to follow, use columns, use subheadings. It also makes it easier to make amendments and change things as you come down the line. Get the raw data right, include gross and net figures on the face of the document, and make sure you're using the correct gross or net figure when needed, and also discuss those figures with the other side. See if you can get them agreed, because it makes things a lot simpler and a lot cleaner. Know what you can and cannot claim. The specific example here, I've been considering what is in a week's pay if that particular claimant is going to be, for example, under the figure cap, as it were, and you're going to be going off the 52 gross weeks. What makes that up, and what could potentially make it higher, which would adjust and can make a significant difference for claimants and respondents alike. Be specific. specify your vendor award, your injury to feelings, give a figure, be specific with the mitigation and the figures, set out all the working and all the figures on the face of the document. So you know what you're working with and know the all-important order, how to apply the adjustments and the percentages, because it will, of course, change that total at the end. And that just leaves me to thank everybody for taking part. I do hope today has been of assistance. Again, it of course is only an overview. If there are any questions arising from today, do feel free to email or contact through to Chambers, and I'm happy to address those and to assist where possible. Thank you very much, and please do join us again for the next instalment.